Okay, great. Well, Reinventing Intuition. Now, what you didn't hear is that I teach psychology and neuroscience at a liberal arts college, and therefore, I've decided to start this talk with a little poetry. So, how do I love thee? Let me count the ways. So you may recognize those lines. They're among the most famous in all of English language poetry. They were written by Elizabeth Barrett Browning during her courtship with Robert Browning. And they were first published in a book in 1850 called Sonnets from the Portuguese. There they are, by the way, Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning. Now, even by 1885, this book, Sonnets from the Portuguese, had become prized by book collectors, even though it was only 35 years old at that time. And this man, Thomas J. Wise, discovered a previously unpublished and unknown first printing of these sonnets from 1847, dated 3 years before the first printing of 1850. It was a small pamphlet. It looked like a private printing that had been done, by Barrett Browning herself. And he quickly recognized the value of this and snapped it up and sold a few of them to some of his collector friends. And he later built a career as England's most celebrated dealer and collector of rare books by finding more and more of these items, previously unknown first printings of important works from the 19th century, and selling them to institutions, libraries, and collectors all around the world. Now, by the 1930s, many years later, two British book dealers decided to investigate the origin of these pamphlets that Wise had been distributing for so long. And they were sort of motivated to do this because the pamphlets had been circulated quite a bit, and many institutions had bought them up, and many collectors sort of had looked at them, and they had fit intuitively into those writers' works. So these two dealers, however, conducted an exhaustive analysis of these pamphlets and found 8 different ways that they were inconsistent with what was known about printing, about literary history, the customs of publishing at the time. For example, this one right here has an ornament in the printing dated 1887, which was not actually designed until many years later. So there's no way that the pamphlet could have been printed in 1887 with an element that hadn't been designed yet. The real killer piece of evidence came from microscopic analysis. They put the paper of the Elizabeth Barrett Browning volume under the microscope and found that it contained wood pulp, which is not that surprising until you realize that wood pulp was not actually used to make paper in England until 1874, or over 25 years after the date on the pamphlet. So these two dealers concluded basically that Wise had engaged in a massive fraud. He had published dozens, scores of these pamphlets actually, that he completely made up himself. And now, Wise is no longer celebrated as one of the greatest collectors and bibliophiles in history, but instead as one of the greatest forgers in history. In fact, he's such a great forger that his forgeries now are sold by dealers. And here you can see one, a one-page by Tennyson that is $500. Now this is not an unusual pattern. Other great forgeries also sell for good amounts of money. Now, this story may sound familiar to you if you have read the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell or heard about his argument. So Gladwell begins his book, his best-selling book, by talking about a statue called a kouros, which was offered for sale to the Getty Museum for $10 million. And a kouros was an ancient Greek statue about 2,500 years old. And the Getty was offered this, and they did some scientific tests on it. The scientific test said, yes, this might have been made probably was made of marble that's that old. So the Getty paid $10 million for it and put it in its collection. And according to Gladwell, only then did they invite some art experts, art historians, and curators to come and take a look at it. And those people famously had reactions like, it just left me feeling cold. Or they looked at it and they said they had a feeling of revulsion. One of them said, it just doesn't look right. Another said, I hope you didn't pay for this yet. Unfortunately, the Getty had paid for it, and it was in its collection. And Gladwell uses this story basically to illustrate his case for the power of what he calls rapid thinking, which is another way of saying intuition. He subtitles his book, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. So the argument here is that in 2 seconds, these art historians, these experts, could figure out what the whole Getty Museum and months of analysis and scientific expertise couldn't. That intuition trumped logical, rational, scientific analysis. Later on in the book, he gives other examples of this. Now, his argument is a little more subtle than that, but many people take the message of that book to mean we should go with our guts, we should rely on our gut instincts and use our intuition more than we already do, that it can help us make better decisions in our lives. As an interesting footnote, the Getty still has this in its collection. It hasn't disposed of it. And the catalog even indicates that it is unknown Greek about 530 BC or modern forgery. There's actually still some scholarly dispute about whether this really is a forgery. This man here is the former curator of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Thomas Hoving, the late Thomas Hoving. He was one of those experts who said it just doesn't look right. And he's a well-known art historian who figures out whether objects are real or fake. Now, what are we to make of this example that Gladwell gives us? Well, Gladwell seems to think this shows the power of intuition, that intuition can trump analysis and logic. However, I think that we have, in order to understand it, we have to put it up against examples like the one I just gave you of Thomas J. Wise. Wise went on for almost 50 years forging these things. They all intuitively seemed right. They all fit in. They were bought by the most prestigious institutions and collectors of their day, and only intensive logical and scientific analysis actually uncovered his fraud. What about other cases of forgery? I'm not an expert on the history of forgeries, but the three examples I could think of all remind me more of the Thomas J. Wise pattern than Gladwell's Koros pattern. For example, this is by Han van Meegeren, who was a celebrated Dutch forger. This was supposedly a Vermeer. By the way, you can buy many posters of this online now. This is such a great forgery that now it's its own work of art. He passed it off as a Vermeer. Analysis of the pigments of the paints discovered that confirmed that they were forgeries. Here's an example. The white lead in the painting had polonium-210 values of 8.5 plus or minus 1.4 and radium-226, blah, 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 not what intuition would tell you. You need to do something other than just look at it for 2 seconds to figure that out and come to the right decision. Here's another example, the Hitler diaries. The Hitler diaries were discovered and made public and published before they were analyzed in order to discover that the paper, the ink, and the binding had to have been done after World War II was over. So unless Hitler was still alive in South America someplace, writing them after the fact, the Hitler diaries could not have been authentic. Also, John Myatt famously forged many modern paintings. Here he is standing in front of one of his forgeries, and was caught by discovering that the records used to forge the provenances of these things did not match up to the way they should have looked. All in all, I don't think the case is made by using a single example that intuition is better than analysis. In fact, the art of the forger consists in fooling our intuitions. Forgers succeed because what they make intuitively looks right to almost everyone, and most forgers probably have gone to their graves without ever being detected. Intuition is not really that good at solving puzzles like this, and I'm suspicious of the idea that we should celebrate it and elevate it above other forms of thinking. So I refer to this belief in intuition as a powerful method of thinking that can solve problems that other methods can't as the myth of intuition. And the myth of intuition is very widespread. So for a research project, my colleague Dan Simons and I did a telephone survey of 1,500 Americans and found that 74% of them agree with the statement that it's a good idea in general to go with your gut instinct when making decisions. A lot of people believe that you should always go with your first instinct when you're answering questions on a test if you have any doubt. Well, that's not true, actually. Changing answers usually works because you've thought it through some more. Now, why is the myth of intuition important? Well, forgeries are one thing. Too bad for the Getty about the $10 million. It wasn't my money, right? Well, here's a guy who we all probably recognize now, Bernard Madoff. Not a forgery, but the greatest Ponzi scheme in world history, the greatest financial fraud in world history. How did he get away with it? Why was Madoff not caught? A lot of people don't realize that the SEC actually investigated him 5 different times at least, and they interviewed him. I'd like to read you now a quote from the Inspector General of the SEC, writing after the fact about why Madoff was not caught. He reviewed the investigations that had been done, and here's what he said. In one of the examinations that the SEC conducted, they asked Madoff how he was able to achieve these returns. Madoff's returns were extraordinary and always consistent. He never had a down period no matter how bad the market. And they asked him, how are you able to do this? Bernie Madoff said to them they had a gut feel of how to time the market. They asked him, what is the basis for this gut feel? And he said it was his observations of the trading room. He said he could actually sit on the trading room floor and feel the market and know exactly when to buy and exactly when to sell. And Madoff always bought at the right price and always sold at the right price day after day, year after year. Inexplicably, the SEC just accepted these answers and went on. This is the Inspector General of the SEC. Now, the only quarrel I have with this is the word inexplicably. If 74% of people really believe that it's a good idea to always go with your gut, and that intuition can be such a powerful way of making decisions, they're not going to be surprised when a guy claims to have been beating the market year after year by trusting his gut and looking at the trading room and picking up stuff from that enables him to always time the market perfectly. Our belief in intuition can get us into dangerous trouble, especially when we're on the SEC and we're trying to figure out whether there are crimes being committed. Now, to contrast the intuitive and rational thinking styles, the intuitive and reflective thinking styles, I'm going to give you a short example from the psychologist Shane Frederick, who's pictured here. This is a really nice demonstration. I'd like you to try it for yourself. So think about this. A bottle and a cork together cost a winemaker $1.10. If the bottle costs $1 more than the cork, how much does the cork cost? What do you think? Okay, I heard some people say 10 cents. Some people said other things. 10 cents is the answer most people give, but it's incorrect. The correct answer is 5 cents. So if the bottle costs $1 more than the cork, and the cork costs 5 cents, then the bottle must cost $1.05, and they total up to 1.10. But most people like to say 10 cents. There's something about 10 cents which is the intuitively correct answer given this problem. And this is just one example of a whole class of problems which get our intuitive systems to basically jump to conclusions that are incorrect. And this is not a complicated science problem. There's no complicated arithmetic or math or algebra involved here. It's easy to figure it out once you know how it works. Part of the problem here is that a lot of our brains operate under a principle enunciated by Danny Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, called Wizziati, or what you see is all there is. So our intuitive systems like to just work with what they can see, make decisions based on what's in front of them, and not really access lots of other information, make complicated decisions, or engage in any real calculation. What you see is all there is a problem for decision making. It's also a problem when you think about computer games. For example, when you see Tetris, you don't know what else is going on behind the scenes and how Tetris got to be that way, right? Now, getting back to the art forgeries for a little while. Intuition, what is it? Is it the same thing as expert pattern recognition? These art experts, after all, have a lot of experience looking at paintings. Maybe they're looking at it and they're just recognizing patterns that they can see because they're experts and the rest of us can't see them that easily. Maybe it's just built up expertise. Well, that is one way of defining intuition, but expert pattern recognition is not the same thing as intuition. Let me show you an example of real expert pattern recognition. This is a video of chess grandmaster Patrick Wolf. Patrick has shown a card with a chess diagram on it, and he only gets to look at it for 5 seconds. You just saw the entire real time that he got to look at it. And he's able to reconstruct it from memory. And you'll see as he sets it up that he does it very quickly. Doesn't look like he's really, thinking a lot about this. His time speed is limited mostly by how much it takes to pick up the objects and put the pieces and put them back down on the board. He's a little wondering about the last one. But as we'll see when the video ends, he only made 2 mistakes, even though there were about 25 things he had to remember the shape and location of. Now, you would be hard-pressed to remember the shape and location of 25 things if I just gave them to you right now. A chess grandmaster can do it because they can recognize patterns that they've learned over the course of a decade or more of study. You'll see shortly the two mistakes he actually made. He only got 2 of them wrong. This was the original, and there are the mistakes he made. That's expert pattern recognition. That's not the same thing as our gut instincts or the kind of thinking we do when we trust our guts in making a decision. Now, one problem with intuitive thinking is that it leads us to jump to conclusions. The human mind is really well engineered for coming up with explanations about what causes what in the world, about doing what psychologists call causal inference. Now, even cats can do this to a limited extent. Here's a classic psychology experiment. The cat is placed in a box, the food is outside, and the cat gradually messes around until it pulls down that red object and the door opens, and then it goes out and gets the food. Now, what happens when you put the cat back in is that the next time the cat will be a little bit faster to figure that out, and the next time after that a little bit faster. If you put a human in the box instead, I haven't actually tried this myself, but my understanding of theory tells me that once a human figures out the right move to get the food, it's going to remember that and assume that pulling down that string causes the door to open and enables it to get the food. We can make one-shot cause and effect inferences, and then we take those forward, and we make them based on single experiences usually. We only need to pull it down one time in order to figure out what to do. Now, why is that a problem? Well, because humans are susceptible intuitively to what we call the illusion of cause. So here's an example of the illusion of cause. I just pulled this out of the New Yorker. The New Yorker wrote, "It's inarguable that Geithner's stabilization plan has proved more effective than many observers expected, this one included." Now what's wrong with this quote? This quote is basically saying the economy got better in 2010 because of what the Treasury Secretary proposed and implemented in 2009. The problem is the inarguably part. Okay, there are lots of arguments you could make about that. All we know is that it was this way, something was done, and it was another way afterwards. That's what history is. It's kind of like one long anecdote. Things happen, and we assume that the sequence they happen in indicates what caused what. But of course, maybe the economy would have gotten more better if that plan hadn't been implemented, or maybe the economy would have gotten worse. We don't really know. There's not enough to infer cause and effect, but the human mind, particularly our intuitive modes of thinking, jump to that conclusion all the time. Here's an example of a visual illusion. This is why I call this an illusion of cause, because even once we know about it, it's hard to escape making this mistake. So in a visual illusion, even when I tell you that the guy at the top who seems to be in back is actually the same size as the guy at the bottom who seems to be in front, it's entirely a visual illusion. The guy in the back still looks like he's in the back and still looks like he's bigger to you. It's very persistent. So this belief in cause and effect based on single experiences is going to persist for a long time, even once we know that we make this mistake. Here's another example. This happens all the time in the press. Sex keeps you young. So there was a study that showed that people who had a lot of sex looked younger than people who didn't have a lot of sex. Conclusion, the sex is causing them to look young. I personally think another conclusion is equally plausible, that people would rather have sex with people who look young. This would be very hard to test experimentally, and get it through the ethics committee and so on. But the problem here is that we make this inference so automatically, this kind of thing. It happens all the time in newspaper and journalistic accounts. Another problem we have is we see patterns when they aren't there. So here's Jesus in a pizza. I'll just show you a couple more quickly. This is the Virgin Mary grilled cheese. By the way, the Virgin Mary grilled cheese was sold for a lot of money on eBay. The listing informs us it's not a hoax, in case you were worried about that. Then we have the Mother Teresa in the cinnamon bun, the Virgin Mary on the underpass, and so on. You can see these all the time. Every couple months they come up in the news. Then, of course, the Lincoln-Kennedy coincidence. There's a lot of things Lincoln and Kennedy have in common. Very eerie. We notice these patterns. Our minds, our intuitive pattern recognition devices connect cause and effect. So Woody Allen, at the end of his legendary stand-up comedy routine, would say, "I really wish I could leave you with an affirmative message, but I don't have one. So would you settle for 2 negative messages?" So indeed, so far, the messages have been very negative, right? Intuition is a myth. We're not good at figuring out cause and effect. Yes, there's expert pattern recognition, but the experts are really only good at a few narrow things, and that doesn't help us in our daily lives. But I think I can end with something affirmative, which is how to reinvent intuition. So I think there are 3 ways to do that. One, become an expert at recognizing when you may be jumping to conclusions. Know the situations. Try to see the situations when your intuition might be leading you astray. Think about some of the examples I've talked about here. You could think about other ones as well. Develop an intuition about the value of your intuition is another way of putting this. Realize that intuition is not all it's cracked up to be, that people trust it too much, and that there are other better ways of solving problems, especially when the stakes are high, like investing your life savings or spending $10 million on a new statue, or many other matters. And then finally, gather data, use the outside view, which means think about it as an outsider. Think about whether you're making the right decision and whether you would advise other people to make this right decision, or whether there are ways that you would advise them to decide instead. Try to reframe the problem. Think about it from different points of view. And then, of course, think twice and act once. And finally, if I can get to my last one, don't jump to conclusions like this unfortunate woman. She should have thought twice, and perhaps instead of saying that an elephant was larger than the moon, maybe she should have asked the audience instead, or thought it through a little bit more. Thank you very much.